for all, a few roll in wealth and luxury while many suffer for the actual comforts of life. It is not strange either that those who control the money are the ones that roll in wealth, while those who do all the work and produce all the commodities grovel in want. This is the result of ignorance on the part of the producing masses, and is about on a par with that fabled transaction in which were concerned two cats, a monkey, and a piece of cheese. In the place of that crude and unjust system, the Iron Republic employs a scientific method that is just to all. The value of every product is scientifically fixed by the average cost of production, and when a man produces anything he delivers it to the great popular trust called the government, and receives therefore its asientos, which are certificates of its value and deposit. As everything that is produced is placed in escrow just the same, these asientos are exchangeable for any other commodity on the same basis of value. These asientos, then, are the circulating medium, and not a diem of them can exist outside of the national exchange unless its value in some commodity exists within it. As long as there is a diem's worth of any commodity in the hands of the government in exchange, there is outstanding somewhere a diem to represent that commodity. When that commodity is withdrawn for consumption, the diem is absorbed by the government and the financial incident is closed. These asientos are numbered and dated and must go through the exchange once per year, either in exchange for commodities or new asientos. They are reissued every year. So if any are lost or destroyed after the date of the annual funding, they are made good to the loser if he has preserved the numbers so that his loss can be identified. Under this system, no great store of money can be hoarded anywhere, and there is no temptation in that direction, as it cannot be made to yield interest or increment. In carrying out this great governmental trust, 4 billions of diem are issued and absorbed annually, and so the great financial tide ebbs and flows with the regularity of certainty of the tides of the ocean. Best of all, no man can receive value until he produces value, and so we have a great human hive in which there are no drones. This may seem to you a small volume of business for so large a nation, but as middlemen are practically eliminated and there is no wasteful competition, a mutual exchange of commodities is effected with much less trading than in your country. And have you no merchants at all? I asked. Oh, yes, was the answer. We have a considerable number of men engaging in supplying the wants of the people, besides those employed at the exchange, but they can hardly be called merchants, as they are in reality caterers. They establish themselves in locations more convenient to the people of certain sections than the exchange, and receive a small advance over the exchange prices, merely on account of that convenience. The exchange fixes the price, though, of everything, and the caterers are only paid enough more to pay for this convenience, as the exchange is open for all. Of course, this applies only to the commodities that are handled in the exchange. There are many commodities, perishable goods, confectionaries, and an endless variety of gimcracks that are not received into the exchange at all and are dispensed by the caterers. Your absolute cash system undoubtedly saves a vast amount of loss and litigation, said I, but men are compelled to have accommodation or suffer, and that, it seems to me, is where your system would work great hardship. If there was no remedy, replied the professor, it were still be better that a few should suffer than many, but the system provides even against this. If a man has nothing, he is a pauper, in the language of your country, and could not get accommodation there nor anywhere else. If he has non-perishable property of any kind, though, here he can go to the exchange in his commonwealth, and get asientos to the amount of 50% of the value of the property without interest. Of course, he must give a bound for his value, signed by freeholders to protect the exchange against loss. Referring to these asientos, is it not possible to counterfeit them, I asked? It might be done, answered the professor, although they are printed on specially prepared paper. But as every man who passes one may be required to endorse it, it would be like counterfeiting a bank check in your country, which can be done by anybody. The penalty, though, is severe, and as we have no idle class, there is no criminal class, and any kind of misdemeanor is a rare occurrence in this country. I should think, I remarked, that having to endorse these asientos in every small transaction would be annoying. They are not used in small transactions, was the reply. They may be deposited and converted into fractional currency at any post office. Indeed, and what are the denominations of your money? Well, our lowest denomination is the minium, which represents 5 minutes of labor. Then we have 3 minutes, 6 minutes, which represents 3 minutes of labor. Then we have 5 minutes, 6 minutes, and the hora, which is supposed to represent an hour's work and a day's work. Here is 8 hours. The hora is worth about 12.5 cents in your money. Above this, we have either the quarter dime, half dime, and dime. In the larger denominations, there are 1, 2, 3, 5, and 10 dimes. Money here represents labor, and labor is made the basis or unit, if I may use that term, of its value. 12 miniums make an ora, 8 oras make a dime. While this conversation, so dry and uninteresting to the ordinary reader, was going on, many places of interest were pointed out to me, and I was keenly alive to the beauties of the city through which we were rapidly propelled. Afterwards, we passed out into the country where on every land were the same evidences of prosperity I had seen in the city. Modest but comfortable homes, paved roads, every resource of nature taxed to the last degree to subserve the convenience of man. It must have taken a great while, I remarked, for people to reduce the art of living to this point of perfection. On the contrary, replied my friend, the change was wrought in a very few years. When the people found that it paid to live in this intelligent scientific way, and the spirit of reform got into the air, they went at it with a vim. We were going through pleasant, shady lane, on one side of which were some cattle standing under the trees, and on the other a man plowing in a field with a horse, the first I had seen. We were yet some distance from a farmhouse when, hearing a humming noise behind us, I looked around and saw a box, or a car, almost as long and thick and about half as wide as a square piano, running towards us on 2 cables stretched out on poles. I had noticed these cables and a lot of other wires, but I had not learned all of their uses. Here's another new thing on me, I cried, standing up in the carriage to see the thing go by. That is the Rural Express, said the professor, laughing. And then he directed the motorman to keep up with it until we passed the farmhouse, that I might have an opportunity to see it work, if it should have something to deliver there. It was returning about 30 miles an hour, and we spurted along by it until it passed the house. The boxcar, or carrier, ran 8 or 10 feet above the ground, and when it reached the pole in front of the house, one of a number of knobs or cranks that protected it from the side of it engaged a pin on the pole, and several packages were thrust out of the rear end of it and dropped into a box-like receptacle attached to the pole just below it. A gong was rung, and at the same time a lady came out of the house, lowered the box with a pulley, and took out the packages. This rural delivery, the professor told me, was one of the newest public utilities and was just being introduced. It had provided a success, and the Department of Progress intended to put them on throughout the Republic. They were run from the exchanges and post offices and carried, besides mail, packages up to 20 pounds in weight. The cables also carried electric light and power currents, and the carriers ran in circuits going on around and back to the starting point when empty. Several of them passed us while we were on the line of the circuit and were running continuously. This section of country was an elevated plateau, and to the northward could be seen the blue outlines of the Illyrian hills. The afternoon was perfect with an Indian summer haze, and as we traveled at the rate of about 20 miles an hour, we traversed a wide extent of territory. Scenes of Arcadian beauty were spread out everywhere, and as I thought of the miserable hirelings and wage earners of America and the Old World, the sweatshops and crowded tenements, the dwarfed and stunted lives that result from the mad struggle for wealth, I said feelingly, I would to God the poor of my country could come here when they die. It would be heaven to them. What more could heaven be? Exclaimed the professor, stretching out his hand toward the lovely undulating fields. To live, to labor, and to love. Is that not heaven? Unharrowed by galling apprehension of poverty and want, walking the sweet sequestered vale of life and taking from the hands of all-providing, beneficent nature of every good and beautiful thing that can minister to our wants, what more can heaven be than an endless continuation of the same? And this would be the condition of the whole world if men could learn the unwisdom of selfishness, or were but wise enough to combine for mutual protection against themselves. His wife gazed upon him with an affectionate admiration, but the beautiful daughter looked away listlessly, as though she were bored with it all. I felt with a pang of disappointment that this beautiful woman must, after all, be shallow and feelingless, but when a moment later she turned to me with a wistful look in her eyes and asked me if I did not think that if one had been born in heaven and had never lived anywhere else, they would grow tired of it. I comprehended something of the feeling that made life so tiresome to her, even in so blessed a country. And again, I snapped my fingers at the fiddlers of Ionia, for, said I to myself, although I knew little of the female heart, no woman would become ennuied with this glorious country if she had really learned to love, and the object of her love were here. We encountered motorcycles of every description and passed through several shires where the National Exchange buildings, post offices, and public schools looked like the buildings of some old barony or monastery of the Middle Ages, but with what a difference! These people were great and free, with no feudal masters to fatten and fight, or shaveling priests to feast and fatten on the fruits of their toil. Each for all and all for each, not because they were more unselfish than their less fortunate fellowmen, but because they had learned that only a few could be great and rich, and acting with the wisdom and power that belonged to the majority. They had mutually agreed that none should be rich, and none great, except in noble and unselfish way that made greatness one of the common heritage and pleasure of all. Making a wide detour, we came to the Urbana River and followed its course back to the city. It was as picturesque as the Hudson, but no palaces lined its banks. Modest and unpretending cottages, comfortable and adequate, many of them beautiful in design, but all simple and unostentatious, as though built more for the use than to advertise the station of the owner, faced the wide boulevard that ran by the river like the long winding streets of an old-fashioned American village. We had reached the great dam only a few miles from the city and stopped to look at the public buildings where the million horsepower of the mighty river was transmuted into that subtle, incomprehensible force that night and day ran hundreds of miles of railroad, thousands of electric lights, rural express carriers, mills, and other public utilities. "See," said the professor, as the sun touched the horizon, "a great ball of fire. The grand old sun, after lighting and warming us all day, will still by this water he has lifted from the sea work for us all night." It was beautiful. Far up the river to a distant bend, the water above the dam lay smooth and placid and flashed like silver. On one side, a steep wooded bank descended from the boulevard to the water's edge, where were rustic docks and boat houses at intervals along. On the other side, a wall of rock, perpendicular in some places, and seamed and serrated like the rough, chiseled facade of some old giant's castle, rose sheer to the height of nearly 100 feet, over the edge of which in some places fell great festoons of flowering vines. "Those lovely banks," said the professor, after I had admired their picturesque beauty, "were once crowned with the villas of the manufacturing, commercial, and financial barons of this country. The masses labored for them, the great river toiled for them. Now, where pretentious palaces once vied with each other to advertise their owners' wealth, stand the happy homes of a people are neither masters nor slaves, and the great river too is masterless, for lo, it works for us all." At this moment the great sun disappeared behind the horizon, and as the broad amber bars of light flashed up and expanded like a flaming banner in the sky, a deep solemn chime of music came rolling grandly down from towards the city, whose outlines could but dimly be discerned against the background of night that loomed behind. On came the music, stately and grand as became the time and scene, sinking to deep, sweet symphonics that seemed to breathe the spirit of the blessed contentment and repose. Anon it swelled to magnificent burst of glorious music that carried a note of exultation and triumph, like the exulting paean of a world-wide victory of the ages. Unconsciously I uncovered my head under the spell of the divine nocturne, and in every direction as far as I could see, on the boulevard or in boats upon the river, men stopped and listened reverently as to the Angelus. For 10 minutes the glorious strain swelled from the Tower of Music, rolled out over the fading landscape, echoed and reverberated along the walls and cliffs of the winding river. And then, ceasing, with a flash, 10,000 electric lights punctuated the gathering darkness, and the great city gleamed in flashing outline like the realization of a fairy scene in a story of the Arabian Nights. I looked at my host. His eyes were closed. He sat with such an expression of solemnity and peace upon his noble face that I felt a thrill of awe, as though in the presence of an inspired prophet of the olden time. I turned my eyes to the queenly woman that sat before me, and the spell had worked not less powerfully on her. Her head was thrown back, her hands were clasped, and from her half-closed eyes the tears were running down her cheeks. That music was a man's soul, the soul of genius, lavishing itself on earth-born clods with such beauty and power as for the moment to make them, too, feel that they were divine. And what was I in the presence of a spirit like this? In the exaltation of that moment, so gross a thing as jealousy could not abide, and I felt myself aglow, warm with the sunshine heating upon me. Fiddlers of Aronia! Never again could I force my lips to frame those words. No one spoke save the motorman, who, when the music ceased, and the last rhythmic wave was lost in the darkening reaches of the river, uttered a deep Amen, and at a signal from my host, pulled sharply on his lever, and we shot away towards the city. The critical reader may observe that the conversation and discussions just recorded are better suited to an industrial congress than a drawing room or carriage ride through a beautiful country in the company of beautiful women. But it must be remembered that the astounding conditions by which I was surrounded were entirely new to me. It was as if a man should be born full grown into the wonders of the 20th century, and as a student and politician my environment impressed me no less by wherefore than facts of its existence. Impressed me no less by the wherefore than facts of its existence. When an inquisitive boy gets hold to a mechanical toy, he scarcely awaits to see it operate before going into it to see how it operates. And so, while I was charmed and enthused by my surroundings and interested in my companions deeply in one of them, the emotion of curiosity was uppermost in my mind. The facts of the existence of amazing facts were broadcast before me everywhere. The wherefore of their existence I was reaching after greedily. If I may use such an expression, the isness was like a world bathed in sunlight. The whyness, like a cloud, drifts breaking over the horizon and floating towards me. All of us being somewhat fatigued with the long afternoon drive, we sat up only long enough after the evening to repast and take a resume of the day, and then retired. The next morning I held a conversation with the Captain Brent over the telephone, and then took the train for Egia. The duties of his office prevented Professor Morris from accompanying me, and I anticipated a rather dull ride, but I had no sooner entered my compartment than I discovered that I was in the company of an original character. Peace be unto you, brother," said he as I took my seat opposite him in the car. "Well, the same to you, my friend," I replied, not knowing what else to say. "Do you live in this god-forsaken city of the plain?" he asked, waving his hand in a general way towards the world outside. "Only a temporary sojourner," I said, surprised at his words and the solemn tones of condemnation with which they were uttered. "Even a temporary sojourn in Sodom will do you hurt, my brother," said he sententiously. "Come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Holy Book. Lou was only a temporary sojourner in the city of the plain, but if you will read his subsequent history in the Divine Allegory, you will admit that it could not have been any worse with him if he had lived there all his life. These things were written in the Divine Allegory for our guidance in real life, and we do well to take heed lest we too partake of evil, and so bring ruin upon us." "Sir," I said, looking at him in astonishment, "I am a stranger here, and I must confess that your language is beyond my comprehension. If I may make bold to ask, who and what are you?" "I perceive that you are indeed a stranger," remarked the man with his unconscious swell of pride in his voice, "or you would not need to ask that question. I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, 'Prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his paths straight.' My name is Moses, and I am the founder and head of the Zionists. Unto us is committed the work of repairing the broken down walls, that the people may go in and out in peace. Have you not read the torchlight of truth?" I assured him that I had never seen it. "Aha!" he cried, clenching his fist and shaking it at the universe at large. "The powers of darkness conspire to keep the light from the people, but the truth is mighty and will prevail. Read this," pulling out a newspaper, the first I had seen from a pile under the seat, and handing it to me, "and when you have read it, change your garments, wash your flesh in pure water, and come into the fellowship of Zion." I glanced at the paper, which was printed in Old English, and saw that it was made up, like many similar American publications, of lamentations, proclamations, and execrations and was against everything in general and the Iron Republic in particular. Why is it, I asked, that you employ newspapers while all other news and general intelligence is diffused by the telephone? Because of a conspiracy, sir, a damnable conspiracy, pounding his knee with his fist. In the beginning we put it on the news service, but it was excluded by the Department of Public Utilities on the ground that it monopolized more than half of the service while it was demanded by only a few people. And yes, sir, we put on only about 100,000 words a day. Think of it, sir, the divine truth suppressed because there was much of it, and only a few people wanted to hear it. The very reasons why it should have been given even if it monopolized the whole service. I don't quite agree with you there, I interrupted. As citizens of the Iron Republic, I understand it, and contributing to its maintenance, I should say that you were entitled to the benefit of the news service in the proportion that your numbers compare with the population of the country at large. No more than that, but certainly that much if it is the ideally representative government that it is claimed to be. God's curse on the ideally representative government it is claimed to be, shouted my strange companion violently. What does it represent, sir? Men, not God, the human and not the divine. God is the creator of all things in heaven and earth and should rule the both, not men. I am happy to say that Zionists do not contribute to the maintenance of such a government except in so far as they are compelled to by the use of the public utilities. They have things in common and hold themselves aloof from the exchanges so that they cannot be taxed for the support of such an iniquitous Babylon. My dear sir, I remarked quietly, I am a stranger to you and your creed, and do not wish to enter into any discussion, but I cannot conceive how the Creator of the world can rule in it, except as he does by the laws of nature, which seem to me to be inadequate for the government of a civilized state. You cannot see how the Creator can rule the world, he exclaimed. None are so blind as those who will not see. Read my book on the theory of divine government. How did he rule Israel in the divine allegory? Was it by voting and drawing lots and putting Smith, Smate, and Smathers in office over his people? Because they happened to draw their seals out of a wheel? I say no. He called and anointed his servants to rule over his heritage, to give laws, and to make his will known to men. Ah, I exclaimed, catching his drift. You mean that all rulership should be in the hands of those only who are called and inspired for that purpose. Well, that is exactly what I mean, he answered. If the people are ruled by men who are divinely called to that high function, they must be ruled according to the will of the supreme ruler, which is the only perfect way. But how could we know who were called to these high offices? I ventured to inquire. Well, how did the people know in the divine allegory that Moses and Samuel and Paul and David were called? Because it was revealed to these men, and they made it known to the people. How do I know that I have been called to rule this nation in the name of the Lord? Because it has been revealed to me, and I must make it known to a stubborn and stiff-necked race, whether they will hear or whether they will forbear. The powers of darkness are leagued against the truth, but the arm of the Lord is not shortened, and he will triumph gloriously over his enemies. So, I mentally ejaculated, cranks are not the result of the environment, but of our common human nature, for they breed them even in the Iron Republic. My friend, I remarked, not wishing to argue with him, as I had some experience with this genius in America. I have no controversy with you being at the present time a student, and humble pupil of any who will teach me, but several times you have referred to a divine allegory. What do you mean by that? The Bible? The divine allegory, my brother, is the holy word that has been given to man in figures and emblems for his guidance in the stern realities of actual life. It is called the Bible, or Word, and gives us knowledge of the will and relations of the divine to the human. But I ask, why do you call it an allegory? Is it not a record of the real facts of God's dealings with man? Why, certainly not, he replied. That were impossible. But why impossible? I persisted. Simply because there is no possible basis for such real facts. Where is your